You can be opening your Bibles to Esther chapter 3. And before we get into this, I would just, it'd mean a lot to me and Samantha right now if you guys could be praying for Hannah and Elliot. They've both been very ill all day long. And so please be praying for them. Hannah's not able to keep anything down like all day. I don't mean to distract from what we're looking at tonight. There's already enough distractions with some Super Bowl or something. On Sunday nights, we've been looking through the book of Esther, and this is now our third lesson in this book. And one of the things that I think we're going to see from these chapters is that God's people throughout history have always been opposed and oppressed. And from some of the first pages in the Bible, we've seen that. Cain and Abel. Even Joseph and his brothers, when his brothers are acting like the world and Joseph is trying to seek to serve the Lord. You've got the Israelites that are in Egypt. You've got in the New Testament the Christians that are squashed and scattered by the persecution, but that they go and they spread the gospel wherever it is that God takes them. We're going to see the same thing in Esther 3 and 4 when this collision course begins to happen with a man named Mordecai, who we've already seen a little bit of, and another man named Haman, who we're going to be introduced to in this book. But remember, previously in the book of Ruth, in chapter 1, Esther has become queen. And many times people will look at this as some kind of beautiful love pageant thing. And we looked at it last time from the perspective that this is more human trafficking. To just take all the prettiest women in the Persian Empire and gather them up so that Xerxes the king can have whichever one he wants. The story doesn't end after Esther chapter 2, and they lived happily ever after. Instead, this introduces us to this great conflict that's going to happen between God's people and the Persians. Now, I want to point out, before we start reading from this text, that in the first 3 chapters of the book of Esther, there's been time markers. In Esther 1:3, the book began in the 3rd year of King Xerxes or Ahasuerus' reign. And then in Esther 2:16, it was in the 7th year of his reign that he married Esther. And now in chapter 3, verse 7, it's going to tell us that it's the 12th year of his reign. So when we get to Esther chapter 3, Esther has been married to Xerxes for 5 years. And we've got these events that are going to take place. The way that we can look at these 2 chapters is in Esther chapter 3, the Persians are going to make a plan to eradicate all the Jews. And then in chapter 4, you're going to have the Jewish people coming together and trying to figure out some plans that are going to help thwart the plans of the Persians. And so you got in chapter 3 a meeting with the leaders of Persia, and then in chapter 4, a meeting with the kind of leaders of the Jewish people. And so let's go ahead and begin in reading Esther chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 to begin. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. And he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. As we begin looking at this section here, Haman is going to be the 4th and final major character that we're going to read about in this book. And he's introduced in verse 1 as being an Agagite. If you recall back to the time in 1 Samuel 15 when King Saul was supposed to wipe out the Amalekites, the king of the Amalekites was Agag. And so for this man to be introduced as an Agagite goes back, at least conceptually, to these people that the Israelites were supposed to destroy. And we've already seen that Mordecai is connected to King Saul. And remember what it was that God had said to the Israelites after they first fought the Amalekites in Exodus 17, verse 16. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So you've got two guys that represent two lines of people that are going to be at war with each other from generation to generation. This is like the Hatfields and the McCoys or something like that, but the Bible version of it. But it's this man, Haman, who in verse 1 is promoted to a high position in Persia. Notice that verse 1 begins by saying, it was after these things. Well, what things is this referring to? Remember back at the end of chapter 2, when Mordecai discovered the plot that people were going to kill Xerxes, and he saved his life? And then the next verse says, after these things, it's not Mordecai that's promoted, but it's this evil, wicked man named Haman. Have you ever seen this in the workplace before? Where people who should not be promoted are the ones who are promoted? Why does that kind of thing happen? Well, you got this same sort of thing happening here, where a very unqualified man, Haman, is now like in second command in the nation of Persia, and when you get the wrong guy in a position of power, he's going to negatively affect everybody around him. Now, we haven't seen really his wickedness yet, but did you notice that Mordecai has some problems with Haman? Xerxes commands everybody, all right, this is the guy that's second in command. I want everybody to bow down before this man, and Mordecai won't do it. He's asked why he's not doing it, and he doesn't give an answer in this text. And there's two different theories people have proposed as to why he won't bow down before Haman. One idea is that this is a righteous refusal to honor an ancestral enemy. Because God said that there's going to be war between these groups of people, and maybe Haman, acknowledging all of that, goes, I'm not going to show you any respect because we're supposed to be at war with one another. Maybe that's what he's doing. Maybe another perspective, though, is that he's just being stubborn. Is there anything wrong in the Bible with bowing down in honor to somebody who's got a position of power? This is not to be equated with some kind of worship. Because, for example, in Genesis 23, verse 7, Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites. Would anybody look at that and go, well, Abraham, you shouldn't be worshiping those people? Or what about Moses in Exodus 18, verse 7? Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down. None of us would say that either of those things are wrong, but many people have equated Mordecai's refusal to bow down because he doesn't want to worship Haman. He's not worshiping him. Nobody that's bowing down before this guy, I think, is worshiping him. And so there's different perspectives. You could look at it like it's a righteous refusal because he knows that it's an ancestral enemy. Or you could look at it like he's just being stubborn and maybe jealous, and he doesn't really have a good reason to do this. Now, you can reach any conclusion you want to on that, but the text doesn't tell us what his motives are. Do you know what the text does with his refusal to bow? Is it pushes this story forward and lets us know that this is what causes Haman to want to destroy the Jewish people. Haman was filled with fury. Can you imagine people telling Haman, hey, next time you walk by and everybody's bowing down before you, pay attention to that one guy over there. And everybody bows down and he looks over and he sees Mordecai the Jew not doing it. Instantly filled with fury. And when he's disrespected, he, like us, overreacts. The text says that it's not just that he wants to kill Mordecai, he wants to wipe out all of the Jewish people that are in the Persian Empire. Notice, by the way, that this is not just isolated to the capital of Persia. This is the whole Persian Empire. Guess what's included in the Persian Empire? Jerusalem still is. And so are the Judeans. Because remember, it was the Persians that said, go back and rebuild. Because the Persians had authority over all of this territory. Therefore, what Haman wants to do here is threatening the whole bloodline of Jesus. But before we keep reading, can you think of times that you've overreacted to being disrespected? Somebody steps on your toes, somebody disses you, maybe publicly, somebody says something that's embarrassing to you, and then you become passive-aggressive for the next 5 years. And you never settle whatever it is the issue is, or you start spreading gossip about these people or whatever it might be. We have a temptation whenever we're mistreated to overreact. It's not that we just want to go have a conversation with that guy that wouldn't bow down to me. It's that we want to destroy him, and we want to destroy everybody associated with him. Notice what happens next, though. There's this evil decree that's going to be sent out, and don't miss the parallel to chapter 1 of Esther. In Esther chapter 1, Vashti refuses to walk before all the drunk men at that party. And when she refuses to do that, it causes a public decree to be sent out that all the wives are to respect their husbands. And now in chapter 3, Mordecai disobeys an instruction, and it's going to lead to this decree being sent out to all the empire. So look at Esther chapter 3, verses 7 through 15. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces, and to the officials of all the people, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Notice here that Haman wants to go to the guy that can green light all of his vindictive desires. And when he goes to Xerxes, he's not giving Xerxes all of the facts. Instead, he begins by saying, "Hey, king, there's a certain people, I'm not going to name who they are right now, that are really bad, and they don't keep the king's laws," which is not even totally true. Because who was it that saved King Xerxes from death? It was one of these Jewish people. And so he's misrepresenting all of this, but letting Xerxes know, it's really in your best interest that all these people are killed. And by the way, I'll give you 375 tons worth of silver. Now, you'd expect a righteous king to maybe weigh out what's being said. Maybe go do some research, try to figure out some things about these people. But you imagine Xerxes maybe just sitting on one of his gold couches, and he just takes off his signet ring, which is short, like it's his signature. He would press it into wax, and it would be like his family crest or some kind of symbol that shows that I'm greenlighting whatever this thing is. He just gives him a blank check and says, "Go ahead and do whatever it is that you want with these people." In verse 11, the money's given to you. The people also, it seems like Xerxes is saying, I don't even need the money, but go ahead and destroy these people. And so he allows the enemy of the Jews, the description of Haman here, to go ahead and do that. Have you seen in this chapter and in the chapter before this, in Esther chapter 2, hey, let's go search out all the young, beautiful virgins so that you can get a new wife. Okay, let's go ruin the lives of maybe 2,000 women. Go ahead and do it. Hey, we're concerned about some people. Can we go kill them all? Yeah, sure, go ahead and do it. Look at the way that this ungodly man is ruling his nation. It doesn't really matter what happens to the populace if there's some kind of benefit that I might be able to get from it, or one of my higher-ups is going to make him happy, go ahead and do that. Now, before we keep looking at what happens next, do you notice anything with Haman here? And how fake of a front he puts on. Hey, king, I'm just really concerned that something bad could happen in your empire because of these people. Have you ever had a time before where you acted like you cared about something else than what you really cared about? I remember the first time anybody ever challenged me on that, and it stuck with me. When I was in Minnesota, and I was a newer Christian, and it was before I met Samantha, and I was trying to figure out if there was any girl that would ever want to date me, and for some crazy reason, I just couldn't find any of them. And there was a girl that had been coming to church, and suddenly she wasn't around as often, very sporadically. And I remember talking to one of the members of the church saying, hey, do you know what's going on with so-and-so? I'm really concerned about her and her soul. And he looked at me and he cocked his head and he said, there's other people that are kind of having the same pattern. Why is it that she's the one you're bringing up? How come you've never brought up these other ones? I thought, oh, he knows what's going on. Do you ever act like, oh, I'm really concerned about this or concerned about that, but really what's behind it is some other desire? That, by the way, is manipulation. It would be better to just be open and honest about things. But this leads into this proclamation that's going to happen. Did you notice the proclamation in verse 13? It's going to be written all over the place in every language to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate. What's the difference between those three things? I don't know. But the point is that these people are going to be totally destroyed in one day. There's one day that's going to be given to purge these evil people from among them. Did you notice the date that this was announced in the text? In verse 12, the 13th day of the first month. Anybody know what's ironic about that? This decree is being sent out on the 13th day of the first month, the day before the Passover begins. The day before the Jews would be getting ready for Passover, the day they'd be getting ready for Passover, because it's the day before they'd start worshiping in this way, they're finding out that there's a new tyrant, there's a new Pharaoh. And the book is starting to echo some things about the Exodus, showing that there's going to be a greater Exodus that's going to take place here, but the date of the actual purging. So you got the date that it's announced that it's going to happen. Well, what's the date that it's actually going to happen? And you see this in verse 13, the 13th day of the 12th month. 11 months later, there's going to be this day of purging, which historians have pointed out was March 7th, 474 BC. How did they figure out this date? Casting lots. You remember what Proverbs 16:33 says about lot casting? The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. It's like the Lord is giving the Jewish people the most amount of time possible to be able to prepare for this day of purging. And we're going to see as we go through the book of Esther that God's providence is going to come through and they're going to be okay. But right now it looks really bad. Did you notice in verse 15 the way that they seal the deal? Xerxes and Haman sit down and they have a drink, cheers. We're going to kill a bunch of people. That's awesome. And then everybody in the city is in confusion and scared. Do you realize that throughout history, there have been political rulers who could make decisions that would cause the people to be frightened, but they can sit around having a drink, celebrating their decision? Do you think we'd ever have politicians like that today? I sure don't think so, but maybe we do. Well, I think one of the purposes of the book of Esther is to show us that political rulers are so often used by Satan to do his dealings. You read the book of Revelation, and it makes these same kinds of points. We're naive to think that every politician is truly a public servant. But notice, if that's what happens with the Persians and their planning. We shift over to what's happening with the Jewish people. Look at Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 8, and we'll see the reaction of Mordecai. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. And he cried out with a loud and bitter cry, and he went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of the people. Try to imagine this. Like the two leaders of Persia, cheers. People on the streets crying and weeping, lying down in ashes. And here's Mordecai, who has some kind of job where he's by the king's gate on a regular basis, and he's weeping bitterly. Have you ever heard somebody weep before? Have you ever heard somebody weep bitterly? There he is with his sackcloth on, and he can't go into the king's gate. Like you need to dress up better than that to be before the king, something like that. You know, one of the things that the Jewish people were really good at was expressing their grief. You want to know one of the things that I'm not always very good at? Is expressing my grief. Do you suppose that is maybe part of our culture as Americans? You know that the Jews used to hire people to mourn at weddings to make other people comfortable crying so that they could cathartically express their emotions? Here's Mordecai in the streets, weeping and wailing, and the news gets up to Esther, and Esther tries to send him some new clothes, maybe so that he can go into the king's gate and get closer to her so that they can talk. Maybe that's the reason, I don't know. But he talks to Hatak, and the rest of this chapter is going to be Mordecai and Hatak talking, and Esther and Mordecai giving messages between this man. And he comes down, and you can imagine Mordecai giving him the copy of this decree. This is what's going on. How come it is that all these people living in the king's gate, they don't know what's going on? You know, the upper crust of society oftentimes don't have to be concerned about all the things that us peasants have to worry about. What Mordecai wants of Esther is to go and plead with the king to change something. Do something about this situation. And the rest of this chapter is going to be this persuasion that Mordecai has over Esther. Look at verses 9 through 11. And Hatak went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. Can you imagine, the concern that Esther has here seems pretty legitimate. You know, we've been married for 5 years. It's been 30 days. It's been a month since he's called for me to see him. But everybody knows in the kingdom that if somebody's got a dire request and they want to waltz before the king, it's at the risk of their own life. And there's occasional times where the king might hold out his scepter. And if he does that, that means that I'm not going to die. But can you imagine living in a kingdom where people have the courage to finally come before the king, and he just sits there emotionless, doesn't hold out the scepter, and then people are dragged away and killed? That's the kind of circumstances that Esther's in here. What is it that she's going to do? Well, she's eventually going to go before the throne, but it's going to take a lot of courage for her to do that. Does this contrast at all with the king that we serve? Hebrews 4:16, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Would you describe Xerxes' throne as a throne of grace? The kind that you could just boldly come before? No, this is clearly not what it is. Do you realize that we don't serve a king like Xerxes? We have a king that wants us to come to him, that wants us to plead with the needs that we have, like we talked about this morning. Are you taking advantage of the graciousness of the king that we have? This is Esther's concern, though. But keep reading. Look at verses 12 through 17. Esther chapter 4, starting in verse 12. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than any of the Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether or not you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told him to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. There's some things about this text that is debatable, what's happening. When Mordecai is seeking to persuade Esther, notice in verse 13 when he says, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all of the Jews. Why? Isn't it odd that he says that? Hey, Esther, I told you to hide your Jewish identity, so theoretically, on the day of purging, you're going to be safe because you've been hiding your Jewish identity. What's the deal with him saying, hey, Esther, you're going to die too when this happens? Is he threatening? It's possible he's threatening to reveal her identity to get her to go talk to the king. Or it's possible that he's saying, well, if you're not going to be faithful to your Jewish identity now, then it could be that divine judgment is going to come upon you. So you could take that either way, but you can think about verse 14 when Mordecai says, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Is he saying there, like many have believed, that, I believe in the promises of Abraham and God's going to preserve the biological nation of Abraham? Is this a moment where Mordecai just has so much trust where he says, if you don't do it, Esther, God's going to figure it out another way? Maybe that's what he's saying. That could very well be what he's saying. But it sounds like quite a contrast from verse 13, because he says, you're not going to escape any of this, Esther. And then why would he say that in verse 14? You realize that you could quote, or you could translate verse 14 this way, just as equally. For if you keep silent at this time, will relief or deliverance arise from the Jews from another place? Being a rhetorical question. It could be that he's saying to Esther, hey, you're going to be destroyed, and if you don't do this, is relief going to be found anywhere else? If you don't do something, Esther, we're all going to die. Now, you can take that either way. But do you know what I won't take away from you? Is verse 14, the end of it. Who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That's still a beautiful statement. Nothing will take away the beauty of that statement. Even if he's twisting her arm, possibly using manipulative ways to do that, the text just doesn't give us all the details of this, but this statement is still a beautiful statement. Esther, seems like God's providence has put you into the position of queen, and maybe you've come into this for such a time for these things to happen. But then you could be thinking, Mordecai, if you would have just bowed down to Haman, none of this would have happened, but this is the situation they're in. Is it possible that the Lord has allowed you to live to this point in your life and to have the sphere of influence that only you have and the unique experiences that you have in your life where there's only certain hands that you can hold. And there's certain people that you have the best access to teach them the gospel. And certain brethren that are struggling with different things, where because of your life experience and your situation in life, you're the best one to be able to help those people. You know, sometimes we look to changing our circumstances so that we can serve the Lord better. Here's Esther in a very difficult circumstance, and in the circumstance, she's being encouraged to figure out, how can you serve the Lord considering everything that's happening right now? Don't be wishing different circumstances constantly. Be thinking about how these situations can be used for the Lord and His purposes. And however you want to detail everything that Haman is saying here, Esther's response to it all is that she accepts. Throughout the book to this point, things have been happening to Esther. She was taken up in chapter 2 to become the queen. Now, she's the one ordering Haman, do this, call for a fast for all the people. There's going to be friends that she has in this harem, it seems like, that they're going to be fasting as well. She famously says, if I perish, I perish. That sounds a little bit like Daniel and his friends. That if you want to go ahead and destroy us, and God might deliver us, but if He doesn't, we're going to go ahead and still do the right thing with the opportunities that we have in front of us. Esther is willing to perish. Sometimes I'm scared to lose a friend. Sometimes I'm scared of somebody looking at me like this. And Esther's willing to perish. Shame on us when we've got opportunities in front of us to serve the Lord with the unique circumstances we have. We should be willing to perish if it would come to that. She calls for the fast. There's nothing in this text said about praying. Again, this is one of the books of the Bible that doesn't ever mention God. But maybe this is a veiled reference to fasting and prayer to God, who is not mentioned in the book, but His providence is on every page. Can you imagine Esther being encouraged by all these people fasting, Mordecai going out and telling everybody to do that? You know what we can learn from that? Is that for us to make the best use of the opportunities in front of us, we don't Lone Ranger this. We do this with our brothers and sisters in the Lord. How much are you relying on the wisdom of other people, the encouragement of other people, the rebukes of other people, to be who it is that God has asked you to be better leaders, to be better parents, to be better teachers, to be better spouses, whatever it might be? Do we rely on one another for those kinds of things? God's people throughout history have always been opposed by the world. You can argue that there might be shady reasons why they're being opposed here. It may not be totally because of righteousness, but at the end of the day in this book, Jesus' bloodline is threatened, and God's going to take care of His people. You know that God takes it personally when the world attacks us? When Saul was persecuting Christians, and Jesus says to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Every time the world pushes back at God's people, we have a God that'll execute vengeance one day, and in the meantime, provide for His people. Are you serving that God? Do you serve that God that you can go to without fear of being condemned, like Esther was afraid of even her own husband? If you don't serve that God and you're not right with Him, you're not just on the path to a collision course with maybe some people in the world, but ultimately with God that you have enmity with. We're going to sing the song, Zion's Call. Everybody's called to be able to come to the Lord and receive His blessings and be part of His people and be promised His protection. If there's anybody here tonight that needs to get their life right with God, the Bible teaches that you do that by repenting and being baptized. And if there's anybody here tonight that's done that and they've not been living like they need to, please don't leave here or come forward while we stand and sing and get the help of the congregation.